of Mary, which is a creative search agency where he leads on strategy and experience across brand, B2B, influencer engagement, SEO, and data analytics. Over to you, Dan.
Cool. Great, so I'm going to talk you through 8 ways to ruin your content strategy. Now, content strategy, of course, applies to all stages of the marketing funnel, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to focus on the top of the funnel, i.e. building our brand, as that is generally collectively where we are most bloody useless. Now, we know that building our brand matters. It matters because of the 95-5 rule, as taught by John Dawes, that told us that for every 5 people that are actively in market, there are 95 people not yet in market, and therefore if we're only talking to those people actively looking to buy, we're ignoring the vast majority of our customer universe. We know that it matters because of the work by Google and Bain that told us that 92% of our customers will buy from their day one shortlist, and therefore if we haven't been busy building our mental availability in advance, we're going to be battling it out with the 8% of other shit munchers, all presumably competing on price. And when we're talking about price, we know from the work of Kantar that those organizations that successfully build their brand can command up to twice the price relative to those that don't within the same product category. We know this stuff instinctively, and yet because of digital wankers like me that entered the industry in the early 2010s and promised countless new ways to target those in market, to target the 5% rather than the 95%, we forced all of our attention to the bottom of the funnel. And the consequences were catastrophic, as shown by the work of Field and Burnett in their seminal book, The Long and the Short of It. And as the graph shows here, from 2012 onwards, marketing effectiveness took a steep nosedive. Now, I believe that for many brands, a great content strategy is the key to turning this shower of bollocks around. So to compound the damage that I did a decade ago, I want to share 8 ways to ruin your content strategy before it's even begun. Now, first of all, just before we jump into that, I want to just clarify what we mean by content strategy and what we don't mean. So content strategy is not some fancy piece of software promising to reimagine and elevate our content like never before. It isn't ChatGPT doing our job for us. It isn't some miserable monthly content calendar held together by sellotape and regret. And it certainly isn't some generic set of content pillars that invariably include the words inspire, educate, and engage. Content strategy, like any strategy, is about making choices. So I want to run through what I think are some of the most important choices and how to get them horribly wrong. So step 1 to ruining our content strategy, let's not allocate any budget to it. So anyone who is familiar with the work of Field and Burnett and the long and the short of it will know their 60-40 rule, where they said that the most effective marketing is done when we allocate 60% of our resource to the long, i.e. building our brand, and 40% to the short, i.e. capturing demand, or what they would call activation at the bottom of the funnel. So I want you to think for a moment about how this might translate to your organization, because I think it explains an awful lot of the issues that we see around content strategy. So imagine for a moment you've got 2 buckets, one with brand marked on it and the other with activation. I want you to imagine what of your current activities you would stick in the activation bucket, i.e. any activity that is going to be judged in its ability to drive ROI in the next 12 months. And then in the other bucket, I want you to imagine all the activity that you're currently engaging in that would be judged in its ability to build the brand over the next 5 to 10 years. And my guess is, if you're like most organizations, you're going to have one bucket that's filled to the brim with SEO and PPC and outbound email marketing and event booths and telesales and all the rest of it, and another bucket that is either empty or maybe has a little scrap of paper in the bottom of it that says must be less shit on social in 2026. The point is, a serious content strategy requires serious resources, albeit in relative terms. So if you're a smaller organization, clearly you're not going to be spending millions of pounds on this stuff, but you need to be at least spending as much at the top of the funnel, building demand, as we are at the bottom, capturing it. Step 2 to ruining our content strategy, don't bother picking a lead channel. So some people might be familiar with the term code, create once, distribute everywhere. And at the heart of this idea is the notion that if we focus on the content itself, then the channels will magically take care of themselves. Now, a few years ago, on a podcast I was running, I interviewed Joe Paluzzi, who's sometimes referred to as the godfather of content marketing, a guy who has studied thousands of the world's most successful content marketing strategies to identify the unifying themes that they share. So I asked him about code, and he said, Dan, it sounds great, but in practice, it just doesn't work that way. If you look at the greatest content creators, they're YouTubers, they're bloggers, they're on TikTok, they do one thing extraordinarily well, and then they diversify. The same is true for any brand. So why is this? Well, for a start, what works on one channel isn't necessarily going to work on another. We have to design our content around the functional, algorithmic, and human idiosyncrasies of the channel in question. But it's more than that. I'm sure some people will be familiar with the idea of Pareto's law, the 80-20 rule, that says that 80% of the value of something will be derived from 20% of the source. So a football team might score most of their goals through 2 or 3 players. Most businesses will generate the majority of their revenue through a minority of customers, etc. Well, the same is true of our channel activity. More often than not, if you're running activity across half a dozen different channels, you'll see that one of those channels will account for the overwhelming majority of your success. So the sooner you identify that channel, the sooner you can double down on it, both creatively and in terms of any ad spend. Otherwise, we're going to end up doing a whole bunch of things terribly. Now, there are some caveats here. So if you're a huge brand, you have no choice but to be everywhere from day one, and you've got the resource to make it happen. Fine. Even for smaller brands, I'm not saying that you can't still chop up that content and repurpose it elsewhere. That's fine. But that isn't a channel strategy. That's just posting shit everywhere. And finally, once you have achieved a level of success on your lead channel, by all means diversify, particularly on social media. The landscape is constantly changing, so in the long term, that risk mitigation through diversification is hugely important. Now, while we're talking about channels, I want to give a particular mention to one that often gets neglected at the top of the funnel. We tend to think in a digital context when we're talking about building our brand in terms of social media. But actually, I think email is always worth a mention, because it is an absolute, whilst it has limitations in terms of extending our reach, it is an absolute powerhouse for maintaining mental availability among our existing customers and networks. It is also our only one true digital asset. If you get thrown in LinkedIn jail, for example, for having the wrong opinion, or that squiggly-haired cybercop from Meta raises the cost of advertising to the point that it's completely prohibitive for your company, there's nothing you can do about those things. But your email list is your asset. And perhaps most importantly, engagement rates have stayed remarkably resilient, which can't be said of any of the other channels. This is some data from SparkToro. The blue line is open rates over the last 20 years from email. The pink line is click-through rates. Now, open rates, as you can see, have basically remained static. Click-through rates have declined very slightly as we become conditioned not to click on links quite so much as we once did, but still remarkably resilient compared to other channels. Step 3 to ruining your content strategy: don't bother finding a creative angle. So the number one predictor of marketing effectiveness is your current brand size. I think it's an 18 times multiplier, which is a slightly depressing thought if you're not a huge brand. But if you are a smaller brand, on a more cheerful note, the second is creativity. And often smaller brands have a lot more scope for taking a position or taking risks when it comes to creativity. Unfortunately, most content prioritizes rational and bland generic messaging. And there is a huge cost to this, as demonstrated by effectiveness experts Adam Morgan, Peter Field, and Karen Nelson Field, who worked with the ad testing platform System 1 to show that, on average, companies have to spend 2.3 times the amount in order to achieve the same level of impact if they've got boring content versus those companies that are leading with emotionally resonant creative content. So the cost of this creative malnourishment is profound, both for individual businesses and indeed for the economy on a macro level. And just to say, if you're from a B2B background, things are particularly tragic, with 78% of content eliciting no emotional response whatsoever. So how do we make sure that we don't fall into this trap? Well, great content strategies are about focus. If your content strategy reads like a shopping list of generic activities, that is not a strategy. If it's white papers and blog posts and podcasts and carousels and all the rest of it, that is not a strategy. That's a headless chicken glued to a bull in a china shop in the middle of a wild bloody goose chase. Strategy is seeing 50 opportunities and knowing which 49 to ignore. So I want to illustrate this with just a couple of examples from people I particularly like on LinkedIn. So one is the fabulous copywriter Dave Harlan, some people might follow him, who for several years now has more or less every single week shared his Confuse the Scammer posts, where he winds up these scammers in his DMs until they lose the will to live and eventually they end up blocking him. It's completely brilliant. He's done it for years and it just gets better. System One have consistently shared content where they show the ability of ads from major brands to elicit emotional responses from their audiences. And this content format has almost become synonymous with the System One brand. And then the wonderful Rob Mayhew, who does his very funny agency parody sketches. And again, he's done this almost every day now for 3 or 4 years, and it's generated him a huge audience, both on LinkedIn and on TikTok. The point is, if we want a great content strategy, it's not about doing 1,000 different things, it's about doing one thing 1,000 different ways. And this has been backed up by System One themselves with their data that's shown that the most effective advertising is done by those teams that execute creativity with the greatest consistency over time, both in terms of their initial impact and how it improves over a course of years. So this is fantastic news operationally, as it means we don't need to lurch from one angle to another, one big creative idea to another. So where does this come from? Well, in a perfect world, we would occupy such a distinct place in the market that it would simply flow from there. But this is not a perfect world. Most of us are active in very busy, congested spaces. So we have to think more laterally. Now, of course, there's no blueprint for creativity, but I think that whenever you look at the most creative people, particularly in content, you notice something. That invariably, they are the people that know the most stuff. They know the most about their business they're representing. They know the most about their audience and what their audience cares about. They know the most about the competition and what they're up to. And perhaps most importantly of all, they're forever inhaling ideas from adjacent and even unrelated markets that they might be able to lift and shift into their own world. Too often we think within content that creative inspiration is found at the bottom of a frappuccino while we're sat around on beanbags. It isn't. It's found at the end of shitloads of hard work and finely tuning our content radars. Step 4 to ruining our content strategy: avoid weirdness at all costs. So time is a precious commodity. The average person is going to see your content for just a couple of seconds. So if we can extend that to a couple more seconds, the impact at scale is profound. Not least because the algorithms are going to get this lovely signal back that this content deserves more exposure, and from there it can go exponential. So how do we buy this extra time? Well, we have to realize that the human brain is a pattern recognizing machine. It looks for these patterns as shortcuts, but that also means that when a pattern is broken, we stop and stare. So what do these headlines have in common? They don't make any bastard sense, do they? Also, side note, I'm not sure you'll ever find a swan that isn't at least a little bit smug. But anyway, the point is we have to spark a little bit of intrigue, a little bit of curiosity. We call this the curiosity gap, and it can apply to anything. Now, in short-form video, there might be something that just feels a little bit out of the ordinary. Until recently, I'd never listened to a poem in full in my life. But over the last couple of months, I keep finding myself getting served content from this lady, Whitney Hanson. And if you pay attention, you might guess what it is that initially meant that I lent in and I actually listened to her content. You might notice that she's got 2 different coloured eyes. Now, I don't know if she actually has 2 different coloured eyes, or if it's a contact lens or clever editing, I'm not sure. But the point is that it broke my expectation. There was something about it that just didn't quite make sense, so I lent in, and that gave that signal back to the algorithm that there was something about this content that deserved more exposure. On YouTube, it's all about the thumbnail. So I'm not commenting on the content of Diary of a CEO. I'm probably not the only one that thinks that it might have seen better days. But what I would say is that the effort that they invest in testing different hooks and different little elements of weirdness and just disrupting those patterns of expectation is such a big part of their success and something that we can all learn from. Step 5, forget all about brand codes. So grabbing people's attention is pointless if we don't immediately and distinctively look like us. And we achieve this through clear brand codes. You might also know them as distinctive assets or fluent devices. So for Mary, we kind of went a bit overboard with this. So like any company, we've got a logo. Although I should say logos are generally considered one of the least effective forms of brand codes. We have a lead color palette that we call cardiac crimson on account of the fact that it's the color the faces of the characters turn when they get particularly mad at each other. But where things get more interesting is with the characters themselves. So the System 1 data shows that characters are one of the most effective forms of brand code, and yet fewer than 1% of brands globally use them. They've also shown that if you're going to have a character, it should probably be an animal, and if you're going to have an animal, it should probably be a dog. So we gave Mary a couple of pets as well. We also use a couple of jingles, because again, they're shown to be particularly effective forms of brand code. What this means is that what Mary may lack in elegance and visual sophistication, she hopefully more than makes up for in distinctiveness. What we want to avoid is content that looks like it could belong to anybody. So I took this from a post on LinkedIn the other day. Very large marketing community, has about 1.3 million followers, get loads of engagement, and mostly it's meme-based stuff. I've got nothing against memes, but the problem is there's no codification. I would question how many people that have engaged with this post would actually recognize the brand that it's come from. Step 5 to ruining our content strategy, don't leave any money for promotion. So traditionally, brands would spend only a small amount of their resource on content and the majority on media to get it in front of the right people. But so often we act as if content alone is enough, particularly smaller brands. They just focus entirely on the content and then act as if the job is done. Let's put this into some numbers very quickly. So let's imagine we spend 10 hours creating a killer piece of content, a conservative £50 an hour, that's £500. And then if we don't put any money behind it, maybe it gets seen by 500 people and we hurry off onto the next piece of content. Whereas if we'd taken another £500 and stuck it into a bit of promotion, that might now be seen by tens of thousands of people, which means that the cost per impression has gone from like £1 down to maybe a couple of pence. Obviously, those numbers are absolutely made up and nonsense, but the point is that most brands would be far better off creating less stuff but promoting it properly. That said, I would encourage you when you first begin to focus on organic, because it means you'll push your the kind of creative limits to the edge, and then your money will go so much further when you do transition into paid. Step 7 to ruining your content strategy, track everything. So I would always encourage companies to focus on a single metric, or at least no more than a couple. If we track lots of KPIs, all with the same weighting, we can tell any story we want. I always say this to clients. If you want us to track 50 KPIs each week, brilliant, absolutely we can do that. And guess what? Every week is going to be a brilliant week, right? I can spin any story you want with 50 KPIs. But if we have to focus on one or two, now there's clarity, now there's accountability. So what should we not be measuring this thing in? Given that this is about top of funnel, building our brand, what do we not want to be measuring this thing in? 3 letters. Correct. If we measure it in ROI, it's going to drive all the wrong behavior. So what do we want to measure? Well, I would suggest, there's different ways of looking at this, but I would suggest some combination of an indication of reach and an indication of attention. If we only focus on reach, impressions can be very, very misleading. There was some work done by Lumen Research a number of years ago that showed that only 9% of impressions online are looked at for more than 1 second, right? So not all impressions are created equally. So I'd suggest some combination of those 2 things. And the final step to ruining your content strategy, put your feet up and watch the magic unfold, because once the strategy is done, surely that's the hard part out the way. Unfortunately not. This is where the real work begins. The greatest challenge with content is not in strategy, but in the execution. And I would encourage you to split it into 2 very distinct phases. We have the launch, and I'll say this a couple of times, the launch takes as long as it bloody takes. The only goal during the launch phase is to test and learn. And I'm just going to share a couple of my experiences within this. I'm conscious I'm running out of time, sorry, I'll speed up. So just going to run through a couple of my experiences here to illustrate. So about 10 years ago, I started a marketing podcast, interviewed hundreds of leading marketers from around the world. Learned loads, built a great email list, fantastic, but I never did much with it on social until about 2020 when I thought, right, I need to kind of lean into this a bit more. I need to start getting some maybe like little audiograms up on LinkedIn, see how it goes. And I thought that given the huge followings these people had, the reach would take care of itself. Unfortunately, by the time I actually did it, every bastard and his sister had a podcast on LinkedIn, and the results were not quite as hoped. This is Justin Welsh, who has about 17 trillion followers on there, and I think it got, 9 likes. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to try something else. I'm going to try some talking head videos. And again, the results, they weren't much better. So I stopped and I thought, if I have one skill, what might it be? I think it's probably writing copy. So I sat down and I wrote a kind of more mid-length post for LinkedIn, and I thought, you know what, this is it. And it got over 1,000 likes, and I was like, brilliant, I finally cracked it. And the following day, I thought, you know what, I'll follow that up with another banger, 4 likes. So at this point, I did what I always do when I feel like I've hit a brick wall. I went for a long walk. Now, earlier on, I mentioned that sometimes the best ideas can come from completely unrelated markets. Now, there was a blog that I'd always loved called Wait But Why, written by a guy called Tim Urban. And in these very long blogs, he would sometimes include these incredibly shit drawings. And I thought to myself, do you know what? I can do shit drawings. Like, I can only do shit drawings. So I jogged home excitedly, and I started scribbling down this idea, and I put it in the context of this sort of office scene, this little kind of stick person drawing. And the following day, Mary was born. The point is, this is about testing and failing until eventually we don't. And when we finally see that we've landed on a content angle, a creative angle that actually has legs, now and only now do we double down. If it takes 3 months, brilliant. If it takes a year, then it takes a year. Now, finally, we move on to the ongoing execution. I'll go through this very quick. So the average number of months for a content strategy to deliver consistent business outcomes is 18 months, right? This is a marathon. Unfortunately, usually before then, even with the best content marketing strategies, we get pulled back into the bottom of the funnel and the campaign gets pulled. In my opinion, the only way to avoid this is by defining incredibly clear business as usual activities, those routine monthly tasks that happen every single month designed to facilitate a long-term strategy. And then most importantly, we have to wrap them in barbed wire and broken glass, and ideally station a big bloke with a baseball bat next to them, ready for the next twat to walk in from sales, asking for help with their slide deck for the big meeting next Tuesday. I cannot stress this enough. If we're going to protect our long-term content strategies, we have to become absolute monsters at saying no. Right, that's it. Apologies, I ran over slightly there. So I did have...
Writing everything down there, Dan, honestly.
Sorry, so I thought I had one more slide, but
you don't.
Apologies.
You surprised yourself.
I
There
did,
you go.
I did.
Well, you know what? We'll not complain. But Dan, honestly, fantastic. There was so much information there, and I could see Rachel at the next table just scribbling away too. Thank you so much. Have we, anybody would like to ask a question? No. Even better, you might have escaped without any having to answer anything. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dan Holt, everybody. Our penultimate speaker at the big marketing meetup.